Hi, my name is Pippa Norris at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and I'm here to talk about our latest book, Cosmopolitan Communications, Cultural Diversity in a Globalized World, which is written with Ron Inglehart. This book is just out with Cambridge University Press, and I'd like to summarise firstly, what are the theoretical arguments about the impact of globalization and cosmopolitan communications on national cultures? And then I'll talk a little bit about the evidence that we use and our key conclusions. The argument that globalization is really changing cultures around the world is a long-standing one, and there are really three previous views in the literature about how change is going to affect the world. The most common view is that as globalization has spread, and we see the growth of organizations such as News Corporation, the Disney Corps, in particular American media, then what we can see is that the world is going to increasingly converge in its culture. This view in the past has been called things like cultural imperialism or the McDonaldization. And the argument is that as American movies, television, and news spreads around the world, so increasingly cultures are going to resemble each other, our values, our attitudes, our norms. And the cultural cosmopolitanism argues that that's one view, which is very common. A second view, however, which is also out there in the research literature, says it won't be that there's convergence. Instead, there's a process of polarization, in particular in the Middle East. As movies, as television, as news spreads, there's a rejection of some of those values, particularly in deeply traditional countries which don't accept some of the core messages. A third view, however, which also exists, is hybridization, and this view suggests that instead there's an import-export model. Yes, it's argued that Western media are going to affect traditional cultures, but it's also true that the West itself is importing ideas from different places. For example, American television takes a lot of program ideas from Britain, from the Netherlands, from Germany, from other countries around the world, and then re-exports them. So you can think of hybridization rather like California cuisine. It's not particularly American, but it's also partly Vietnamese, Chinese, Indian, Mexican, French, and so on. Our view presents a new theory, and it's really emphasizing the barriers to communication and saying that some of the previous arguments have been exaggerated. And what we say is that there are at least 4 firewalls which are limiting how people receive these messages. The first barriers are barriers of world trade. Yes, it's true that middle-income economies are certainly very much part of the new media markets, countries such as Brazil, countries such as Russia, but many of the poorest countries around the world, the least developed societies, are not having large markets for these media messages. So countries such as Mali and Benin are cut off from world trade. Secondly, there are barriers which also exist in terms of freedom of information within each country. So, for example, China is closely connected through importing videos, through importing computer software. But because of the limits which the government imposes on freedom of information, it means that nevertheless many of the messages about politics are being either censored or limited across national borders. The third set of barriers, which are also important, are there because of the lack of access. And again, the poorest countries in the world aren't connected, as we know from the digital divide, to ICTs, to new technologies. But because of pervasive illiteracy and poverty, they're also not connected to many of the old traditional media, whether it's newspapers or television broadcasts as well. And lastly, there are the barriers of social learning, where in traditional cultures, people aren't just learning from the media, they're learning from their family, from their community, from their peers, from their friends, from their colleagues. And all of those means that the media impact might well be exaggerated. So there are different arguments in the literature about how the rise of cosmopolitan communications might affect national cultures. What we do is we gather new evidence from the World Values Survey, and from the first time in the latest wave, 2005 to 7, we've included a battery on whether people use the media. So we have whether they use, for example, on a regular basis, newspapers, television, the internet, books, magazines, and other sources of information, or whether this isn't necessarily part of their lives. And what we can do then is classify countries in terms of whether they're part of the information flows, and we can also classify within each country whether people are regularly using the media as a main source of information. And we can look at whether this changes people's values across many different dimensions. For example, we can look at whether it changes their ideas of nationalism, whether they feel part of a cosmopolitan community or whether they feel strongly nationalist. We can look at changes in things like moral values, for example, towards sexuality, towards tolerance of homosexuality, towards approval of gender equality. We can look at attitudes towards democracy and politics, and we can look at attitudes more broadly, especially those which are concerning economic values, for example, towards capitalism. So our key question, in the most cosmopolitan societies, does use of the media reinforce Western values? Our conclusions are essentially that many of the earlier theories have exaggerated the impact of the media on cultural change. In particular, if we look, for example, at sex and morality, we can look quite clearly at whether people have tolerant attitudes towards, for example, homosexuality, divorce, marriage, and gender equality, or whether they're traditional. What we find is that the media does have an impact. Those who most often use the media do have more tolerant attitudes on these values. And we also find that living in a cosmopolitan society and using the media reinforces these effects. But at the same time, in many traditional cultures, because of all the firewalls, the impact of this is limited. For example, it's there in urban areas amongst the most educated, but it's not necessarily amongst the rural populations or the poorest populations in each country. So cosmopolitan communications has an impact, but the impact is limited through the firewalls in terms of its diffusion. And our conclusion also emphasises that this is not simply important theoretically, but also in terms of public policy. Many international and multilateral agencies, including the European Union and UNESCO, have become increasingly concerned about these issues. And their arguments are that the public, particularly in indigenous groups and in minority cultures in developing countries, is being threatened by the growth of globalization and cosmopolitan communications. What we argue is that we don't necessarily need new forms of cultural protection, as UNESCO suggests. Instead, what we need to do is understand that there are already forms of barriers to how far these communications are changing national cultures. And instead of thinking about limits, we should actually try to maximize freedom of the independent media and the growth of cosmopolitan communications as information flows across national boundaries. So our study will be controversial. It does take to task many of the established theories and tries to give some new evidence and some new theoretical ways of understanding these issues. I hope that you find the book of interest. If you'd like to look further, you can find it available from Cambridge University Press and from Amazon or from any other booksellers. And the cost is about $25 for the paperback version. As we say, it's just available, and we look forward to arguing further about many of these issues and debating the impact of cosmopolitan communications across different countries. Thank you very much.